When England finally got its act together and decided that they were going to start colonizing North America, they established the Jamestown colony, and it didn't do well at first. Um, they had that long starvation winter. Um, Despite the wonderful efforts of John Smith and John Radcliffe, um, they did not do well. So they said, hey, if we're going to make this a sustaining colony, what else do we need to do? So they sent women over because they said, hey, we need to make new generations of colonists to make it a sustaining colony. So, how do we have new generations of colonists? Well, we can't just have men over there. We need women there to make babies. So they sent women and other and more boats of people over to try to make it a sustaining colony, and it did not work. Despite growing tobacco and exporting that very profitable crop to England, they just weren't making enough money. And the King of England, James I, was not happy. So he looked at the Virginia Company and said, I'm taking you back over. But other things were happening over in England at this time, um, that were affecting colonization. And on one such voyage, the boats got blown off course a little bit. And we want to talk about what happened to those boats when they got blown off course. They ended up, um, those boats ended up being blown off course further north than they had originally anticipated. And the reason they were even coming over in the first place wasn't necessarily to make Jamestown profitable. They had their own, the people on those ships had their own reasons for leaving England. And we're going to talk about who those people were on those ships and why they were coming to Jamestown in the first place. And the fact that they didn't land at Jamestown really didn't bother them because they weren't really there to necessarily make money for England, because they really weren't friends of England despite being English. So let's talk about who these people were and why they were on those ships in the first place. So here we go. Our learning goal is to explain the story of the Pilgrims. Oh, yes, the Pilgrims. Who they were, where they came from, where they wanted to go, the reasons for relocations, and what happened to them once they got to the Americas. So look at this cartoon closely. Um, Let me see if I can move this sidebar. No, I cannot. Um, what are illegal aliens? Who is being called that in the picture? So we have some obviously Native Americans standing on the shore, and who are some men dressed as pilgrims. And the Native Americans are saying, just how long do you illegal aliens plan on staying in our country? Well, we know that illegal aliens are typically referred to, by that name when you, persons from another country come to um, a country where they're not typically wanted, and they come uninvited. So the Native Americans are addressing the Pilgrims saying, hey, you're in our country. You were not invited. You're not welcome. How long are you planning on invading? So it's a little bit of a tongue in cheek reference to a modern day problem where the Native Americans really weren't inviting the Pilgrims onto their land. And we all know that the Native Americans were here first. So a lot of things were happening in England around the time of the colonization of Jamestown. And English law was passed in 1559 called the Act of Uniformity, and it demanded that all British citizens attend church services and follow the traditions of the Church of England. And this was also called the Anglican Church. Now, this goes way back to King Henry the Eighth. King Henry the Eighth, if you remember some of the stories talked about him, he broke away from the Catholic Church, saying because he wanted a male heir, and the Catholic Church did not allow for divorce real easily. And but and we and back then they did not realize it was the male's genetic material that dictated whether babies were male or female. And it was always blamed on the woman whether the baby was male or female. So he went through wife after wife of trying to get a male heir. And when the Catholic Church would not grant him a divorce or an annulment, he simply broke away from the Catholic Church and formed his own church called the Anglican Church, because he was king and he could do that. So there's a long a long kind of twisted history of how the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, came to be in England. But this English law was passed saying, hey, all British citizens, you have to go to the English Anglican Church. But not all citizens were happy with this, because how dare you dictate how we're supposed to worship? A lot of people felt that this was not right, that the government should not dictate how you were supposed to worship, or the monarchy should not dictate how you were supposed to worship. So this law led to two groups being formed in England. The first group was called the Puritan group. And the Puritan group were members of the England Church who wanted to purify some of the things that the church did. And they said, hey, we're still going to be members of the Church of England, but we're just going to make things a little better. But there was a separate group within the Church of England who wanted to say, hey, this is just too far gone. We want to go ahead and break away from the church. So they were considered separatists because they wanted to break away. So let's go back to our pilgrims, the pilgrims that eventually landed on North American shores. Would they be considered Puritans, or would they be considered separatists? Remember, Puritans were still members of Church of England. They just wanted to clean things up while still staying members of Church of England. Or were they separatists, Puritans who decided to break away? Well, because they were pilgrims who decided to up and leave and travel, they're technically called separatists because they broke away, got on a ship, and sailed across the sea. So, how are the reasons for settling the Jamestown colony separate from settling the Plymouth colony? Well, our pilgrims ended up settling the Plymouth colony because they got blown off course. The Jamestown colony was settled for purely profit. Remember, they originally settled in the first settlers of the Jamestown colony. What were they looking for? Gold. They were looking for profit. Those Puritans who were separatists got on the ship because they were trying to escape religious persecution, basically. They were saying, hey, you're not going to dictate how I'm supposed to worship. They got on a ship because they wanted religious freedom. So take a look at the picture here. This guy is praising God, giving thanks for arriving on shore. He is saying this is purely a religious purpose. So Jamestown's, if you go back to the three G's, God, gold, or glory, the first one was gold, this one was God. So Jamestown was a gold thing, Plymouth colony was a God thing. So the Pilgrims rejected the Church of England and refused to follow its traditions. Initially, they fled to Holland, to seeking that religious freedom. But over time, they said their children began to forget their roots in Holland, and they said, "Why don't we go ahead and go to America? It's a fresh start. We'll go ahead and, make the trip. We'll go on over there." And oh my stars, I don't think my so the Virginia Company gave the Pilgrims a charter to settle in Jamestown, but bad weather forced the Pilgrims to land much further north than they had originally planned for Jamestown. So here's what Jamestown, the Virginia Company, had control over. Well, if you look at this red line, this was all of the Virginia Company's holdings. In the green line here shows what the Plymouth Council, and we'll talk about what the Plymouth Council is, where the Plymouth colony eventually is, where that PL, where the Pilgrims eventually settled. So here is Plymouth. Here's Jamestown. So that's quite a bit of a distance away. So the bad weather forced them to go north, and they're quite a ways away from Jamestown. So the Pilgrims landed in Tory, that in territory that did not have a country. It did not have a government that was controlling it. So because they did not have a government that extended that far, there was no law that governed that land. They didn't have a government that controlled them. So they weren't sure whose rules to follow. So that got them thinking, whose rules do they actually follow other than God's? Here they were escaping religious persecution, and ultimately they were escaping the crown's persecution. And they did it unintentionally. Not only did they escape religious persecution, they managed to escape the crown's persecution, and they escaped the Virginia Company's control, because they're not in the Virginia Company's holdings. They're not even on the Virginia Company's land, and the crown controls the Virginia Company. So they have managed to get out of England's clutches entirely. They looked at that as a sign from God that they are completely free from the controls of England. So since there was no government and no laws, the Pilgrims got together and wrote the Mayflower Compact. This would then become the first democratic government and document in the New World, and it united the colonists together to create their own government. And it would be this document that would later allow the other colonies to look upon it as be kind of a template for the other colonists' document. And they would also look, and later on, when we would separate from England, we would look back to the Mayflower Compact as one of our examples of what we wanted in our own first constitution. So, had it not been for a storm and bad weather, we might not have had this founding document for our own Declaration of Independence and our first drafts of our Constitution. So, I don't know about you, but many Puritans would say, hey, it was divine intervention. From here, we're going to go look at how the French and the Dutch and so many others had their influence on settling the New World.